Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. Looks like you've really kept us busy this time.
Oh, yeah.
Articles, reports, you name it. And it's all about the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria.
Oh, wow.
Really makes you wonder what this means for Iran's place in the world, right? Alliances, power plays, maybe even some chaos. Let's get into it.
It's really something, isn't it? We're not just talking about a simple change in leadership here. This could completely reshape the entire geopolitical order in the Middle East.
No kidding. So let's break this down. First things first, the fall of Assad himself. It's unbelievable how fast his regime just crumbled after 13 years of this brutal civil war.
Yeah.
He had Russia and Iran in his corner, so how did this even happen?
Well, the sources we're looking at today point to the rebel forces, led by this guy, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, taking control in a matter of days.
Wait, days?
Yeah, just days.
That's insane.
Definitely caught a lot of folks off guard. I mean, Assad had this long history of silencing opposition, not to mention all that international support.
I mean, for years he seemed completely untouchable, holding on to power despite, all these accusations of horrific human rights violations. I mean, just think about the sarin gas attack in Ghouta.
Right, and the human cost of this entire conflict is just devastating. Over 500,000 deaths, millions displaced, according to the sources you sent. It's a tragic chapter in Syria's history.
Absolutely. And it really makes you think about the impact on people's lives, beyond the politics of it all. Okay, so we've got this massive power vacuum now.
Yeah.
What's this going to mean for Iran, especially considering their close relationship with Assad?
Well, you've got to understand, Iran's involvement in Syria goes way back, both in terms of ideology and strategy.
Yeah, okay.
They weren't just there to prop up Assad, they were protecting a vital link in this network known as the Axis of Resistance.
Oh, yeah, Axis of Resistance. I remember reading about that. It's like this web of Iranian-backed groups and governments, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, all meant to push back against U.S. and Israeli influence.
Exactly. And the sources really highlight just how invested Iran was in all this. For instance, one report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated Iran was giving Assad something like $15 billion per year in financial support. Plus, they had thousands of military advisors on the ground in Syria.
$15 billion. Wow, that's serious commitment. Clearly, they were betting big on Syria as a way to, project power in the whole Middle East.
Absolutely. Syria was their key corridor. It's how they funneled resources to their allies. Now that Assad's gone, their whole strategy is in serious question.
So are we saying the Axis of Resistance is about to completely unravel, almost like a domino effect?
I think that's a really apt comparison. The sources definitely indicate that Iran is having to completely rethink their approach. The old playbook might not cut it anymore in this new reality.
Let's talk about the economic side of things then, particularly for Iran. They poured a ton of resources into Syria. Did they expect to make a profit from this whole intervention?
They definitely envisioned big economic gains from Syria's reconstruction, assuming that happened the way they hoped. They were signing all these cooperation agreements covering energy, banking, agriculture, everything.
Yeah.
I think one report from this international crisis group mentioned over 40 of these agreements just between 2017 and 2023. They were setting themselves up to be major players in rebuilding Syria.
It's like they were placing a huge bet on Syria's future.
Yeah.
But the articles I sent over paint a very different picture. It's not that simple.
Right. The expected profits just haven't materialized. And a lot of it boils down to Iran's own economic struggles,
Yeah.
U.S. sanctions, internal mismanagement, all of that has made it hard for them to deliver on a lot of the promises they made.
Yeah, one of the reports even mentioned that Iran's exports to Syria plummeted to $120 million in 2023. That's half of what they were in 2022. It's a huge loss. Definitely not the return on investment they were hoping for.
That's a massive hit, no doubt. It raises some serious questions about their overall economic strategy in the region.
Totally.
And don't forget about the ongoing crisis in Lebanon, another big part of Iran's network.
Oh, right. Lebanon's facing this horrible economic crisis.
Yeah.
Hyperinflation, insane public debt, the whole 9 yards. How does that impact Iran's ambitions there?
It's a huge problem for them. It limits their ability to influence things and makes supporting their allies like Hezbollah that much harder. U.S. sanctions on Iran's banking sector just add another layer of difficulty.
It's like they're facing trouble on all fronts. So it seems like Iran gambled big on Syria, and it's backfiring. They're dealing with these economic setbacks, their network of allies is getting shaky, and the whole geopolitical landscape is shifting.
Yeah.
So what's their next move? Do they back down or do they double down?
That's the million-dollar question. From what the sources tell us, there's a definite shift happening in Iran's approach. They're looking more and more toward Eastern powers like Russia and China, trying to counter Western pressure and hold on to their influence.
And their rhetoric is changing, too. There's way more anti-Western sentiment coming from Tehran these days, almost like they're drawing a line in the sand.
Oh, yeah.
One quote that really jumped out at me was from this policy paper by the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. It described Iran's foreign policy as becoming centralized and militarized, with a big focus on ideological resistance.
That's pretty telling. Sounds like their stance is hardening. Less about compromise, more about confrontation. But as you said, will it actually work? Or will it just make things worse for them in the long run?
Well, we're starting to see how the pieces fit together. A toppled regime, a regional power scrambling to adapt, and a whole web of alliances in flux. There's a lot more to unpack here, so we'll dive deeper after a quick break. So we've been talking about Iran's evolving strategy in this whole new Middle East. The sources you sent over really show how they're trying to find their footing, with their allies struggling and their economic power kind of slipping away.
It's a tough spot to be in, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Trying to balance all these different factors, allies struggling, pressure from the West, and the whole region's stability hanging in the balance.
It's almost like they're playing a game of chess, but the board keeps tilting and the rules are constantly changing.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
So let's zoom out a bit. Look at the other players on this geopolitical chessboard. Russia, China, the European Union. What are they up to in all this?
Well, Russia's role is especially interesting. They were crucial for Assad, providing all that military support that helped him hold on for so long. But now, with Assad out of the picture and Russia dealing with their own problems in Ukraine,
Right.
It's really hard to say what their long-term plan in Syria is going to be.
Like everyone's kind of reassessing, figuring out their next move, their new priorities.
Exactly.
What about China? They've been pretty active in the Middle East lately, especially with all those economic deals.
Yeah, China's Belt and Road Initiative is a big factor here. Iran sees them as a potential counterbalance to Western influence, so they're definitely looking to strengthen those ties, both economically and strategically.
One of the reports mentioned Iran wanting to create this transit corridor connecting their territory through Iraq to the Syrian Mediterranean coast. Sounds like a key part of China's Belt and Road vision.
Yeah, that corridor would be huge for Iran. It would let them become a major trade hub, solidify their influence in the region.
But I guess it also raises some eyebrows in the U.S., right?
Oh, yeah. The U.S. and its allies see it as a potential threat to their own interests.
Makes sense. So how's the U.S. reacting to all of this?
Well, they've been pretty vocal in their criticism of Iran's activities, accusing them of destabilizing Syria, supporting terrorist groups, that kind of thing. They've imposed sanctions and are continuing to pressure Iran to change course.
It's like a balancing act for them, isn't it? They want to limit Iran's influence, but they also don't want the whole region to fall apart.
Exactly. And that's where the European Union comes in. They're trying to play a more, I guess you could say, nuanced role.
Okay.
They're pushing for diplomacy, but they also recognize that some of Iran's actions need to be addressed.
Like walking a tightrope.
Yeah, something like that. They're particularly focused on Lebanon, urging Hezbollah to cooperate in forming a stable government, implementing some economic reforms. They're even offering financial aid as an incentive.
So there's a glimmer of hope there, but who knows if it'll work. Makes me wonder, what about the Gulf Arab states? They haven't always been on the best terms with Iran. Are they involved in any of this?
That's actually what's so interesting. Even the Gulf Arab states are trying to figure out this new landscape. They've actually started talking to Iran, looking for ways to, ease tensions and make things a bit more stable.
That's surprising. After all the friction we've seen between them in the past, I wouldn't have expected that.
It really shows you just how much the geopolitical landscape has shifted. Old rivalries are being re-examined, new alliances are forming. It's a completely different game now.
It sounds like the whole region is in this state of flux. Everyone's trying to adapt to this new reality.
Yeah.
But in all this uncertainty, what about the people of Syria? What does the future hold for them?
That's the big question, isn't it? And unfortunately, the sources we've looked at don't paint a very optimistic picture.
One article I read mentioned that despite all the talk about rebuilding and getting back to normal, large-scale projects in Syria are facing a pretty bleak future.
Yeah, Syria's facing massive challenges. Security threats, corruption, a completely devastated economy. Recovering from all that is going to be a long and difficult process.
And with all these competing interests involved, it's tough to see how they can find peace and stability anytime soon. It's like they're stuck in the middle of this geopolitical tug-of-war.
That's a great way to put it. And at the end of the day, it's the Syrian people who are paying the price for this power struggle.
It's a lot to take in. We've got a fallen regime, a regional power struggling to adapt, a whole network of alliances in flux, and a war-torn country with an uncertain future.
It's a lot, for sure. But it really underscores how interconnected the world is. What happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects that are felt everywhere.
It makes you think about the domino effect, you know, the unintended consequences that spread outward.
Absolutely. And it brings us to a crucial point. While we're talking about all this geopolitics and strategy, it's important to remember the people whose lives are directly impacted by these events.
The millions who've been displaced, the families torn apart, the trauma that will probably last for generations. It's easy to get lost in the big picture, but it's those individual stories that make this so real, so impactful.
You know, one thing that really struck me while reading through these sources was the resilience of the Syrian people. Even after everything they've been through, they still have this incredible strength, this determination to rebuild their lives.
It's inspiring, for sure. It makes you wonder, what can be done to support them? What can be done to help create a more peaceful and stable future for Syria?
The sources do offer some potential paths forward, but they're not easy solutions. There's this growing idea that engaging with local actors, even those aligned with Iran, could be crucial for stability.
So instead of isolating everyone connected to Iran, maybe the focus should shift toward encouraging them to play a more positive role.
Exactly. It's about moving away from punishment and toward empowerment, helping to build up local institutions that can provide essential services and support to the people.
It's a long shot, maybe, but it's worth exploring. What else can be done on a larger scale?
Addressing the root causes of instability in the region is key. Tackling things like economic inequality, lack of political representation, and the lack of opportunity that often leads people to extremism.
That's a huge task. It's going to take a coordinated effort from the entire international community.
You're absolutely right. This is where organizations like the United Nations and other international bodies come in. They can facilitate dialogue, provide humanitarian assistance, and help mediate conflicts.
So are we ending on a hopeful note here? Because it sounds like there's a really long and difficult road ahead.
I think the key takeaway is that this story isn't over yet. There aren't any easy answers, no quick fixes. But by understanding the complexities, by recognizing the different perspectives and motivations involved, we can start to imagine a path toward a more peaceful and just future.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in this, whether it's staying informed, supporting humanitarian efforts, or advocating for policies that promote peace and stability. Yeah, it's easy to forget that there are real people dealing with the consequences of these big power moves.
Absolutely. The human cost is immense. And that brings us back to one of the key questions, right? What happens now? What does Syria's future look like?
Exactly. I mean, Assad's gone. All these different groups are vying for control. Is there any chance for a peaceful resolution, or are we looking at more conflict?
Well, it's tough to say for sure. It's really complicated. But the sources do suggest a few possible scenarios. One possibility is that we see more of what we've already been seeing, this kind of fragmented conflict with different factions, each backed by different powers, all fighting for territory and resources.
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah, it's not a great outlook. It would likely mean more instability and suffering for the people of Syria.
Are there any other scenarios, any that are maybe a bit more hopeful?
Well, another possibility, though it might be less likely, is some kind of negotiated settlement. Maybe a power-sharing agreement between the different groups. But that would require everyone to compromise, and you'd need strong international pressure and mediation to make it work.
Yeah, a lot of things would have to fall into place for that to happen. What do you think the chances are of something like that actually working out?
Honestly, the sources suggest it's a long shot, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. The key would be getting all the major players, both inside and outside Syria, on board. They'd need to agree on some kind of framework and be willing to give a little.
So who are we talking about when we say major players? We've already mentioned Iran, Russia, China, the U.S., the EU. Anyone else we should be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, definitely. Don't forget about Turkey. They've been heavily involved in the Syrian conflict since the very beginning, so they definitely have a stake in what happens. Then there are the Gulf Arab states, who, as we discussed earlier, are trying to become more active in promoting stability in the region. And of course, we can't forget the Syrian people themselves. Their voices and their hopes for the future need to be at the center of any lasting solution.
It sounds like no matter what happens, there's a lot of diplomacy ahead. But beyond these different scenarios, are there any specific things, any actions or strategies that could help push things in a more positive direction?
Well, one thing that came up a lot in the sources was the need for a more holistic approach to reconstruction and stabilization. It's not just about rebuilding physical infrastructure, it's about addressing the underlying social and economic factors that led to the conflict in the first place.
So it's more than just rebuilding roads and bridges. It's about creating opportunities for people, dealing with inequalities, and giving them some hope for the future.
Exactly. And that kind of change takes a serious commitment from the international community, both in terms of financial resources and political will. It's not a quick fix, that's for sure, but it's essential for creating the conditions for lasting peace and stability.
So where do we go from here? It feels like we're at a crucial turning point. Syria's future is still uncertain, but the decisions that are made now, they're going to have a huge impact on millions of lives.
This whole deep dive has really shown just how complicated and interconnected global events are, right? The collapse of Assad's regime has set off a chain of events with consequences that reach far beyond Syria itself.
It's a reminder that the world is a pretty small place. Actions have consequences, and events on one side of the globe can ripple out and affect all of us. It's a reminder that we need to stay informed, engaged, and compassionate in the face of these global challenges.
It's also a reminder that even in the midst of all this chaos and uncertainty, there's still hope. The resilience of the Syrian people shows us that even after going through unimaginable hardship, the human spirit can still find a way to persevere and keep striving for a better future.
That's a really powerful thought to end on. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us and sharing your expertise.
Yeah.
And to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep learning about these issues and stay engaged with this story as it continues to unfold.